if you're on PCIe Gen 3, then I guess basically fuck you. Today we're reviewing the XFX RX 6500 XT QICK. That's QICK. We're not sure what they were trying to spell, but whatever it was, they didn't spell it. This is the 6500 XT QICK, and it's a video card that's supposed to be $200 MSRP. We've benchmarked it in both Gen 3 and Gen 4 PCIe for the motherboard and the platform because this card only has 4 PCIe Gen 4 lanes. It is not using the entire by 16 physical electrical wiring allocation that it could use, and so instead has created a bit of a controversy for itself. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. We use Squarespace for our own GN store and juggle complex multi-piece orders all the time with it. Squarespace makes it fast for us to roll out new products with detailed pages full of galleries, videos, and descriptors. It's also useful for your own resume sites, for photographer or project portfolios, or for starting your new small business idea. There's never been a better time to try and start your new business than right now, and we can vouch that Squarespace makes it easy. Visit squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. So absolute basics then, we'll put a spec sheet on the screen. We're not going to read through all the specs, but it's supposed to be a $200 MSRP card that puts it at the lowest run of AMD's current generation offerings in the 6000 XT and non-XT lineup. That puts it below the 6600 we previously reviewed, and price-wise, it's about equivalent to an RX 580 4GB from half a decade ago. And it's also pretty similar to the RX 480, also 4GB from around 1 year before, half a decade. So to have a decade plus one, 6 years in other words. We're also going to be looking at the GTX 1060 as a comparison. We have the GTX 970 and GTX 960 on several of these charts, especially the Gen 3 charts. We know a lot of you are still using Gen 3 systems that might have a perfectly fine CPU, especially because Gen 3 was all the way up until just about a year or two ago from Intel. And so you might only need to upgrade the GPU if you're still doing fine otherwise. That's why we're looking at both 3 and 4 for the PCIe generations on this, but also including a bunch of the older cards because it was one of the most requested things we saw when looking around for comments talking about the 65 XT when it was announced. So hopefully we can help some of you out with some older card comparisons as well. Now, because this is probably going on sale the minute our video goes live, we're going to help you out with the bottom line up front. It's not impressive. The card is pretty underwhelming, and AMD has cut a lot of features off that really should just be there. There's not a great reason why they're not there. Sometimes you see silicon getting physically fused off. Sometimes it's reject silicon that could be allocated to lower down the stack stuff, but this is just missing weird features that make it feel like a really forced artificial product segmentation. So we're not extremely happy with this card as it performs. That's been true in general, but this one, you'll see that when you see the numbers for the 580, which is 2017 versus this, all will become clear. Now, before we really get started, we need to talk about the PCIe situation. This was in the news a lot before the card launched. Although software obviously can tell us how many lanes the card has normally accurately, we can also use the physical hardware and our eyeballs, another software utility that we've recently received updates for, because if you look at the card, you'll see that it's got about, well, by 4 of the traces worth populated at the PCIe foot, the physical slot. This can be okay if the card is hard limited on its performance anyway. For example, if we're talking about a GTX 1050, maybe a GTX 750 Ti, you're not losing a lot on PCIe Gen 3 by 4 because there wasn't a lot to be had to begin with. The actual available bandwidth is irrelevant if the device connected to it will not saturate it, much like with SSDs, for example. You can have a 550 megabyte per second limitation on SATA all you want. If the hard drive only does 100 megabytes per second, it doesn't really matter other than burst speeds. So it will start to matter though, and the problem is that in this instance, it's not just a by 4, by 8, by 16 thing. It's by 4 PCIe Gen 4 is probably fine, but by 4 PCIe Gen 3 is problematic because you're cutting it in half. So PCIe Gen 3 by 4 gives us about 4 gigatransfers per second, whereas PCIe Gen 4 by 4 gives us about 8 gigatransfers per second, not factoring in overhead. That's an insane difference, and it's really for no good reason. We're losing half of the potential throughput for what ultimately boils down to being an exceptionally mind-numbingly cheap way to approach a video card that seems low-end. Certainly the decisions AMD's made here are those of a GTX 750 or Ti, like a $150 card, applied to a $200 card. Now, if they were taking off other features, like CUs or memory, which they've done as well, fine. That has a very real physical cost, especially memory right now. But once you start doing this, it just looks cheap. Talking about pennies in a lot of instances for the types of changes being made. Now, although this won't be a problem for newer CPUs, it becomes a major limitation for older platforms, especially Intel from before, a few months ago. This is one of the cheapest new GPUs right now. It's also one of the best candidates for anyone who doesn't have the funds to just simply buy an entire new computer when their CPU is otherwise sufficient. This also could have been a perfect upgrade path for APU 5600G users, but they lose another key feature, which is encode and decode support on this GPU. The RX 6500 XT lacks AV1 decode. This isn't widely adopted yet, but it will be soon. Netflix and YouTube, for example, are among the leading platforms that are adding AV1 options. The 65XT also lacks HEVC encode support, restricting usefulness if you want to use it for H.265, for example. The end result is that the 6500 XT is maybe useful as an immediate stopgap for a gaming card, but once its gaming usefulness has expired, the card has basically expired. You can use it for video out, sure. You can use an IGP for video out. You can use like a GT 710 for video out. So it loses some of the key features that would make it viable as a true video card, meaning a non-gaming video card as it ages past ability to play games reasonably. There's not a lot of hand-me-down value in this one, which is really unfortunate because it's not like there's a tangible, clear reason that it makes it cheaper to do these things. There's probably some validation cost in there, and cutting memory in half, we could understand where that has a very obvious cost savings. But this is just kind of weird. Enough of all that, let's get into the benchmarks. As stated, we have Gen 3 and Gen 4 benchmarks. We'll kind of alternate between them, and there's going to be a lot of stuff to look at. We did run more games, but you'll see once we get through the however many charts it is, there's not really much reason to show even more of them, so we've cut it off when we think we've established the pattern and made the point. Let's get started. Let's look at some PCIe Gen 3x4 versus PCIe Gen 4x4 results. For this, we're using a new Intel Alder Lake test platform. We typically have used a 10700K for a GPU review bench, which means PCIe Gen 3. For this particular set of data, we're using an MSI Unify X Z690 and i7 12700KF, which means we can go up to Gen 5. Of course, this is limited by what the GPU offers. Testing is 100% identical between the Gen 3 and 4 results, and it was conducted on the same exact platform. We toggled the PCIe generation in BIOS to force the restriction, so what you're looking at is pure data without any screwery between multiple platforms. It's all generated on the same thing. This chart shows a cross-section of 18 results we collected for average FPS. We had a couple more, but we stripped them for reasons we'll explain later. On average, totaling all of these, we saw about a 7% improvement with PCIe Gen 4 versus Gen 3, both on by 4 lanes, as a reminder. The games seemed to fall into two major groups. Either a nominal uplift of 1 to 3%, which is irrelevant, you wouldn't notice it, or a much larger uplift of 15 to 17%, which you would notice. We had some games that were higher still, but we didn't have time with the review deadline here to determine whether they were valid results, so we removed them from now, and we'll revisit them later as we have time to do validation passes. Either way, though, we're seeing at least 15 to 17% at the high end of the results so far, and that's a pretty big gap. The left column shows the game. The Division 2 was the only one that plotted a regression, but that's just variance. We want to be very clear about this. The hard numbers were 50 FPS average versus 49 FPS average. So in other words, although it says 2% regression, it's just normal error. It's part of the testing process, and it is not representative of an actual realized loss. It's just run-to-run deviation, even with a 4-run average for each test. In this average FPS chart instead, you can see that Far Cry 6 produced noticeable swings from 66 FPS average to 76 FPS average. We observed another large change in Shadow of the Tomb Raider at DX12 and 1080p, moving from 63 to 72 FPS average. The Horizon Zero Dawn results also swung notably from 60 to 70 FPS average. Any game that becomes more limited by the 4GB frame buffer will demonstrate a larger change because the GPU is now forced to access system memory. In order to do that, the GPU, as in the actual piece of silicon on the card, has to communicate through the PCIe bus, where it's limited here, into the CPU to the memory, back through the CPU, back down to the PCIe bus and the GPU. AMD could have added more RAM to deal with this on the card, or it could have run more lanes to resolve this issue. But instead it chose to strand PCIe Gen 3 owners with a needlessly worse product. At least sometimes. We'll start with Strange Brigade since we have some interesting data for it and lots of cards tested, first at Gen 3 and then at Gen 4. The RX 6500 XT landed at 98 FPS average with lows reasonably spaced at 83 and 80 FPS. There's really no problems here for frame time pacing, so it looks good. But once you compare it to literally anything else, it doesn't look good. The RX 580 Gaming X 8GB, a card that shipped for about $250 to $260 5 years ago in 2017, yes, that was 5 years ago, is outperforming the RX 6500 XT by 6%. That's just embarrassing for AMD. It can't beat its own similarly priced product from half a decade ago. The GTX 1060 6GB is outdone by the 6500 XT by 20%, so it's not much of an upgrade over a 6-year-old card that sold for $300. Of course, all these numbers are without factoring in inflation. The GTX 960 would benefit from upgrading to the 6500 XT, but then again, you could also buy an RX 580 on eBay for the mid-$200s to $300 range and be better off. We'll quickly highlight the RTX 2060 KO, a $300 card when we bought it, the RX 5600 XT, and the RTX 3060 for other points of reference. The 6600 XT is far ahead of the 65, nearly doubling the throughput. On the Alder Lake platform instead, the results are exactly the same. That's useful because we have a lot more points for comparison on the Gen 3 platform. We're at 98 FPS average on the 6500 XT, so our previous chart is the same as this one for the 65 XT. The 1660 leads the 65 XT marginally. They're functionally the same, and the lows are within the wide margin here. The RX 580 still leads. The 2060 is on the same spot as before, and the 3060 Ti is in about the same spot as before as well, even on Gen 4 instead of Gen 3. At 1440p and with Gen 3, the 6500 XT struggled to hold 60 FPS average. The RX 580 led by about 15% here, expanding its lead at the higher resolution. The GTX 1060 reduced the gap to 9% from 20% before. The 6500 XT thus far is having trouble scaling at higher resolutions. It's not much of an upgrade from the GTX 970 either, but it could be from a 960 or a 1050 Ti, except then again, there are used cards on eBay that might also be better options. With PCIe Gen 4, it's the same result. The 580 still leads, the 6500 XT is still about 60 FPS average, and the 1650, now on the chart, is led by the 6500 XT by about 16%. Our next test is for Total War 3 Kingdoms at 1080p Ultra on Gen 3. The 6500 XT ran at about 38 FPS average here. That's expected because we use this test as an extreme load for feature scaling. This means that we're more interested in the percentages than the values. For percentages, that puts the 6500 XT about 5% ahead of the 580 8GB. That's unimpressive. The GTX 980 Ti and the GTX 1070 still outperform the 6500 XT, and the 5600 XT outdoes the 6500 XT by a huge 60% lead. We don't test this one on Gen 4 yet due to Alder Lake's scheduling issues. Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p Ultra without the Ultra HD texture pack is next. Because we're not using the texture pack, we're still within the VRAM budget. Installing the texture pack will tank this card's performance due to AMD's choice to both limit the VRAM and the PCIe generation where it's a relevant limitation. This is something we troubleshot with Steve from Hardware Unboxed when doing the testing. He was seeing a much lower frame rate as a result of using the texture pack. Neither choice is really the right choice from a testing perspective, so to speak. From a use case perspective, if you had a 65 XT, you'd probably want to turn off the texture pack. From a benchmarking perspective, it actually exposes a really interesting data point, probably one of the most interesting ones here, which is that there's a huge potential 4GB limitation on this specific card with the texture pack being added. On Gen 3, the 6500 XT ended up at 180 FPS average in our testing, putting it about 9% ahead of the RX 580 8GB and 19% ahead of the GTX 1060 6GB. The 1070 and 2060 lead the 6500 XT effortlessly here, and everything from the 2060 and up is in another class entirely. At 1440p, the 6500 XT dropped to 93 FPS average. That's still playable in this game, but other games will be more demanding. The GTX 1060 is about the same here, and the 970 is, for AMD, also embarrassingly close in performance. The RX 580 manages a slight lead outside of error here, and the 1070 is significantly ahead. Gives you a couple of options for used cards. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider tested with 1080p high and on Gen 3 first, we see the RX 6500 XT landed at 67 FPS average. That has it just between the 580 and the 1060. It's also leading the GTX 970 by 24%, and it's being led by the RX 5600 XT by 59%, with the RTX 2060 similarly placed. Frame time consistency is fine, it's just not an impressive performance. Tested with PCIe Gen4 and a newer game version, the 6500 XT held about 72 FPS average, leading the RX 580 marginally, and allowing the 1660 a lead of 11%. The Gen 3 results on this platform, and the game version difference, had the RX 6500 XT at 63 FPS average. It's just ahead of the GTX 1650 by 9%, and just behind the RX 580. Finally for this game, the 1440p results had the 6500 XT as about tied with the 1060 while allowing the RX 580 an 11% lead on the Gen 3 platform. The 5600 XT and up gave a significant advantage. Red Dead 2 at 1080p with Gen 3 had the 6500 XT at 53 FPS average, about the same as the RX 580, but meaningfully ahead of the GTX 1060, amounting to 23%. The RTX 2060 establishes a firm dividing line between the GPU classes here. It's got 78 FPS average for its performance, which is 47% ahead of the 6500 XT. Tested with PCIe Gen4, the RX 6500 XT ended up at the same spot as previously. The results are a little different due to the platform change, but overall, the comparative scoring puts it in the same rank hierarchically as the Gen 3 test. Horizon Zero Dawn is next. At 4K, the card was dropping textures hard, but it still ran. We suspect 1440p might also be prone to this due to the frame buffer limitation. At 1080p though, for the chart we're showing, it doesn't have any texture issues. The RX 6500 XT ran at 60 FPS average here, with lows paced just fine. The GTX 1060 6GB did about the same, although with slightly higher lows, and the RX 580 is outdone by the 65 XT by about 6%. If AMD's goal was to put something out that aims to give RX 580 owners, and I told you so, then they've done a great job on the 6500 XT. On the new platform, the Gen 4 results had the 65 XT at 69 FPS average, leading the Gen 3 results notably. That has it about equal to the NVIDIA GTX 1660 in both average FPS and 1% lows. The RX 580 is down closer to the PCIe Gen 3 version of the 6500 XT test. GTA 5 is next, tested at 1080p and Gen 3. This one had the RX 6500 XT at 73 FPS average, making it about equal to the RX 580 and behind the GTX 970 and 1060 6GB. AMD doesn't look too great in this one. This is a really old game too. Finally, at 1440p, the 65 XT ran at 47 FPS average and fell slightly behind the 580. We've established a clear pattern at this point, so we're not going to keep producing charts. You get the idea. The 65 XT just doesn't deserve more discussion. Power consumption testing is next. Tested at the PCIe slot and the PCIe cables during full load, we're able to look at just the GPU's power consumption, or the full board really. The 6500 XT pulled 111 watts when fully stock, counting all power into the card and not any other power, so it's isolated, and it moved up to 123 when overclocked. The maximum power offset for the card was just 15%, and 15% on 110 watts doesn't give much room for movement. You'd need to play around with undervolting to afford more power headroom to get any real value out of tuning this card. The 6600 pulls about 20 to 30 watts more when both are stock, and the 3060 Black is at about 170 watts, just for point of reference. So really what we're looking at with this card is a classic example of AMD going back to its roots and embarrassing itself thoroughly. AMD's had a number of pretty good launches in recent years. CPUs obviously have done great for the company. Hard to knock them there at this point. Alder Lake is competitive, but that doesn't make Ryzen bad. It's still very good and very competitive. So they've done well there. GPUs, AMD cleaned up a lot of its act with the 6800 and the 6800 XT. We're sort of before the shortage that we're dealing with now. It was like, wow, this is really competitive with the 3080. MSRP to MSRP, which is what we were working with at the time because, you know, it wasn't like this yet. Or it was just starting to get like this. The 68 and the 68 XT were fiercely competitive. And they're very competitive at 1080p, where it outdoes a lot of the high-end 30 series cards. So AMD started off really strong with this RX 6000 series. And now it's getting to a point where when, you know, at least NVIDIA, when it spits in your face with the price of something like a 3080 Ti, at least it's a generational improvement, and certainly it's a generational improvement versus the same price card from half a decade ago. Here what we have is, we're looking at eBay, Amazon secondhand, a couple other places before posting this, And what we have is something that is competitive with cards that are in the age range of 4 to 6 years old that sell for about the same price as this will very likely sell at. Although MSRP is $200, ignoring scalping, street prices, all that stuff, the partner cards are not on average going to be $200. They never are. This isn't new to the current time. It's just partners bake in some extra margin there as they release a million different SKUs, and the average tends to be higher than the MSRP. That's not news. That's normally fine. But what that means here is that it creeps the price up towards things that are older, maybe used, and might be better in some metrics than average FPS, for example. So you lose a little bit of modern power consumption advantage that is gotten with the 65 XT compared to an RX 580 or something. But with an RX 580, you get, at worst, roughly equal performance within like 5% in some of the charts where it's behind, often ahead in performance, and 8 gigabytes of memory. Now the 6500 XT also has that other quirk where, for the 6000 series that is, as you increase the resolution to say 1440p, the scaling advantage falls off, and relative to other cards that it was doing pretty well against at 1080, it starts to lose ground, or they start to make up ground, like we saw with the 1066 gigabyte in some 1440p tests, and certainly with the RX 580. Now, this card overall is a little bit different than the other ones. We haven't recommended many of the new video cards released recently because you know our stance on it. If you don't agree with how we look at the cards and the pricing, if you think maybe we're a little idealistic or whatever, that's fine. We can disagree on that. I fully understand the other viewpoint, but you know, this is kind of the way we do it, and ultimately the numbers are the numbers. It's not really influenced by our viewpoint on it, so you can still take from our data and make your own decision. So that's what's cool about having data and then having an opinion. But the one thing that's different here, ignoring all of our past opinions we've stated about stagnation in the market where you pay $1 more for 1% more uplift, not exciting, that's actually flatlining in the generational improvements. Ignoring all of that, this one not only has stagnated, it has stagnated marvelously. Haven't ever seen something that's like the same price as 6 years ago and the same performance. And not only that, you lose features. And to the extent that is relevant, at least, it's not even a full, they only give you 8 lanes. You get 4. If you're on PCIe Gen3, then I guess basically fuck you. So that's the 6500 XT. If it's between this and something used, give used shopping a shot. Try and buy it where you're buyer protected at least. You can certainly get screwed buying used cards, but you know, you can also get screwed buying new cards from the manufacturer. So your choice, which one you want to, where you want to get screwed, I guess. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more as always. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to help us out directly by picking up one of our toolkits, which are in stock and shipping now, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for behind the scenes videos. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.